Hello, welcome back to the Screw Ensemble Improvisation channel. In this video I want to talk about improvisation as an approach to performance and use the famous 19th century violinist Joseph Joachim as an example. If you are curious about what we think classical music improvisation could be, you can watch this playlist with different explanations. Joachim was a Hungarian violinist, conductor, composer and sought-after teacher who was revered in his time and still is, well, according to Wikipedia, widely regarded as one of the most significant violinists of the 19th century. In any case, he had connections with the major composers and performers of the day, like the Schumanns, Brahms, Mendelssohn and Liszt, founded the renowned Joachim Quartet and was a sought-after teacher and director of an important music school in Berlin. There will be a separate video devoted to his violin method, where he talks about interpretation, and his former student Moser writes about ornamentation. In this video, I want to take an article I recently read as a starting point. She discusses Joachim's part in creating the Brahms Violin Concerto, but also talks about Joachim as part of a new generation of performers. Before Joachim, performers were highlighting their virtuosity, personal special abilities and interpretations, but Joachim, like Clara Schumann, was seen as having a characteristic seriousness, a self-restraint, and most importantly, a fidelity to the composer's intentions. Virtuosity for its own sake had no place. At the same time, Joachim's playing was often described as improvisational, or as if the music's composer came back to life and suddenly stood in front of the audience, performing the work as if improvising it in that moment. Now, I think this is fascinating because, at least in the way I was taught, especially when I was younger, there is a contradiction here. A performance which is faithful to the composer and score implies a sort of singular absolute version, a truth that is the composer's, and we are merely there as a sort of translator. On the other hand, improvisation implies many possibilities, something plural, something that gives us choice and is our own. Also, very generally, of course, improvisation is rarely seen as something self-restrained or serious, and often enough virtuosity is a key element of improvisation. So, in this video, I especially want to show that improvisation does not have to be about adding any notes, but that it's an approach to playing that all of us could be inspired by. It is, in my opinion, also a more historically inspired performance, where the performer actively interacted with the composition they were playing, and where this process kept on going. Every time one plays the composition, there is a different relationship with the composer, the venue, the audience, and oneself. So to illustrate this point, first I wanted to share some of the descriptions of Joachim's playing with you, and then talk a tiny little bit about the few recordings we have of him. Finally, I will also mention how in this time improvisation started being a bad thing, and a little bit about Joachim actually improvising, although sadly we basically have no information about this. I think it's important to talk about descriptions of Joachim's playing because, although they're not factual, we learn from them how a performer was perceived and what was seen at the time as improvisational, even if we may not perceive it as such now. So first of all, we can see how descriptions of good performance in books and methods from the time, so the end of the 19th century, beginning 20th century, talk about the best performance as spontaneous creation. A good example is the slightly later critic Paul Becker, who writes this about the performance of compositions and refers to his term the improvisational idyl. The spirit of the improvisation idyl is to allow the musical work to emerge as though in the moment of sounding through the intimate, creative fusion of composer and performer, and in this way to bring it into accord with the original creative impulse. Musical performance is, according to its origins and essence, an art of improvisation. Becker goes on to say that in his time, performers are playing music purely as a reproduction at the expense of the performer, and says that Joachim was the last great representative of the improvisation ideal he describes before. Famous pianist Hans von Bülow said, "Yesterday Joachim did not play Beethoven and Bach. Beethoven played himself." Brahms described to Joachim that when he heard him play Beethoven's violin concerto, he thought it was actually Joachim's own concerto. He wrote, "I was your most enthusiastic listener. It wasn't at all important to me to take you for Beethoven. I have always considered his concerto to be your own." His student Andreas Moser said Joachim always took the inspiration of the moment. The work is always created anew. And already in 1844, a London reviewer described Joachim's performance of Beethoven's concerto as, "It seems more like an improvised performance." Joachim did not record a lot. Of course, my first thought was to look for added ornamentation. In the two Bachs and his own Romanze, I found about 2 added trills or turns per piece. Sometimes he also adds some terminations to trills in interesting ways that are arguably just versions of a trill. Even that, though, is interesting in the sense that there are different ways of performing trills, which might remind us of Tartini's descriptions. One could also argue that he always added those particular little ornaments. And then it's still, of course, the performer's creative choice, but not really improvisation, perhaps. And this question is especially raised by the Romanze, where we have a recording by Joachim's niece, 20 years after his own recording. She adds the same ornament, which is not in the scores, at least the ones on IMSLP. So was it an addition to a later edition? Did she listen to her uncle's performance or recording or had a lesson? As Joachim and his student Moser write themselves in their violin method, some forms of ornamentation became so often used that they just became part of the piece. In any case, we can see ornamentation was not a big part of Joachim's improvisational presence. The most important improvisational aspect, as mentioned by many, for example by the influential music critic Fuller Maitland, is rubato, the freedom in tempo. In recordings with accompaniment, we even find that he might not be together on the beat with the accompaniment. It really gives the performance a sense of storytelling and performance in the moment. By sometimes taking time and other times moving on, the performer emulates the creative process and adds this tension to the performance. The improvisational approach here is that one uses this tempo flexibility differently from performance to performance, and doesn't necessarily follow what's literally in the score or perhaps even what the composer had intended. Bach's G minor prelude is a wonderful example of this. I don't want to analyze how he does this here, because on one hand I think this kind of analysis is very personal. Is he really speeding up, or for what reason in the music is he doing it? And many people have already made videos about the idea of tempo flexibility. For example, this Early Music Sources video is a really great introduction to tempo freedom in historical recordings. So basically, I'm inviting you to go and have a listen to these famous pieces and kind of get a sense of how Joachim plays with this idea. And I'm hoping that it gives you some ideas of how to approach your pieces now in a slightly more improvisational approach without actually adding necessarily any notes. It is around this time as well that we start seeing that the idea of improvisation has bad connotations. For example, Robert Schumann moved towards a more rigorous approach in his composing, purging elements that sounded improvisatory, like rhetorical stills, variations on simple progressions. And Brahms thought the first inspiration for a composition should be remembered, but then one should take distance from it. And indeed, I think this is interesting. When inspiration strikes for an improviser and you're, in the concert, you often do the most logical things with it because, well, there's only that much time to think about it in the moment and you have, the language in your head with many standard ideas. There's of course nothing wrong with those logical standard things, but sometimes to find new ideas or approaches, one has to sit down and do some writing, even as an improviser. So I'm hoping that this has shown you that improvisation was used and was an important part of the 19th century and even in the early 20th century, but especially as an approach to performance and not necessarily in terms of sounding improvisational or adding lots of different notes. Now, of course, I was still wondering, did Joachim actually improvise entire pieces? I mean, he did compose and he approached his performances improvisationally, so we might expect this. But sadly, very little can be found about him improvising. There's not really any mention in any of the biographies. And interestingly, this is the time where many musicians could still improvise, but chose not to because of the connotations I already mentioned earlier of the empty virtuoso. And Liszt is an example of this too. But we do have some information from Joachim's student Andreas Moser. In a description of Joachim's playing, at the end of it he writes, "In conclusion, there are two other characteristics which deserve mention, as perhaps they do not exist to the same extent in anyone else. His faculty of reading at sight and his power of improvisation." Finally, we have one account of him actually improvising, which I thought would be a lovely way to end this video. It is, interestingly, in imitation of one of the greatest MT 19th century virtuosos. If you are enjoying our videos, don't forget to subscribe to get our new videos, like the videos, share it with your friends, which helps us to make more videos in the future. On the 3rd of February 1847, Mendelssohn's birthday was gaily celebrated in Moscheles' house in Leipzig. Various performances were arranged in honor of the event, his keen enjoyment of which was never forgotten by those who shared in them. Among other things, tableaux vivants were given in the form of a charade on the word Gewandhausorchester. For the first syllable, Joachim dressed up as Paganini and improvised a mad thing on the G string.